Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. I'm Pinky Webb. Today on the program, some lawmakers and groups oppose the proposed Maharlika Wealth Fund. And despite assurances and a push from President Bongbong Marcos, Sister Senator Imee, on the other hand, fears corruption in the use of the Maharlika Fund. Former Bayan Muna Representative and Chairman Neri Colmenares joins us live. And a check on the prices of Noche Buena products, Trade Undersecretary Ruth Castello tells us more later in the program. The House of Representatives planning to approve on third and final reading House Bill 6398, or the Maharlika Wealth Fund, as early as next week. But several groups and lawmakers are raising concerns and want further study. A former congressman is strongly opposing the bill, fearing that the fund may end up in the pockets of corrupt officials, but instead bats for an increase in the SSS pension. Let's go straight to the source of this story. We have former congressman and Bayan Muna Party List Chairman Neri Colmenares. Congressman Colmenares, welcome back to The Source. Thank you for your time.
Thank you also, Pinky. Good morning, Paul.
So you are opposing this Maharlika Wealth Fund. First of all, tell us why you are opposed to this.
Well, the fund, Pinky, is opaque and therefore stealable. Kasi it has really no safeguards, sufficient safeguards at all. If you look at it, the laws on regulation, restrictions on regulatory restrictions are not applicable to the law. In fact, the bill itself says that regulatory restrictions shall not apply to this law. So many safeguard laws are not there. For example, the Procurement Act, which is, regulates bidding of government transactions, not applicable. The review of the OGCC, the Office of the Government Corporate Council, which is required for certain transactions, not applicable. Even the GOCC Governance Act, the title of the GOCC Governance Act is to promote fiscal viability and discipline on government corporations. And yet, it's not applicable. Civil service rules, not applicable. Even the rules on governing the disposal of government assets, not applicable. So this is really a monster that cannot be controlled by any of our regulatory restrictions. And to think that public funds will be plunked in to the fund makes it more
I hope you don't mind,
unacceptable.
Let's try to make this more digestible and understandable for all of us. So basically, yung sinasabi niyo po, sakaling matuloy itong Maharlika Wealth Fund, ang sinasabi niyo, sabi niyo nga monster, hindi ho ba? Dahil, kumbaga, walang mga restrictions, ganun ho ba? Walang safeguards, ganun ho ba?
Yes, no sufficient safeguards. They will say safeguards, but the safeguards are not sufficient. For example, COA daw will audit. But COA's basis to audit is, did you follow the procurement law? Did you follow the tax laws? Did you follow the dividend rules? Did you follow, all these regulations? But it's not applicable. So ano pang i-audit ng COA? Secondly, Pinky, this fund is not accessible to the public, any information. The FOI will not work here because under Section 42 of the bill, it needs board approval if you want to access records and documents. So, the funders, tayo...
So, walang transparency.
Tayo, hindi lang SSA.
Parang ganun po, walang transparency. Because kung gusto po natin malaman kung saan, ganun ho ba, kung saan ilalagay yung pera, magkanong interest ang kinita, o nalugi ba ho ito, it is not something that we will be able to, the documents is something we can easily get because you're basically saying it needs an approval from the board. I guess that would be a majority vote.
Yes, because what the Section 42 says, access can only be upon approval of the board as provided by the law. But the bill doesn't provide any access to information. So pahirapan yan. In fact, ang mga sovereign wealth funds in general, they're very opaque because decisions on investments, for example, if they favored a certain crony over another business sector, you don't know the basis for these investment decisions actually of the board. So the funders, tayo, taxpayers, SSS, GSIS, pensioners, etc., tayo ang nagpondo, hindi natin makuha yung paano nyo desisyonan, paano nyo waldasin yung pera namin. So that's really unjust ang Maharlika Fund, if only in that respect.
So meron pong tinatawag na prone to, I guess, abuse. Kung saan gusto ilagay ni board, yun ho ba yung sinasabi ninyo? Kung saan nila gustong ilagak yung pera dahil sa kanilang paningin o pakiwari, doon kikita ang pera, sila po magdidesisyon nun.
Yes.
Okay.
Kasi the law doesn't provide any guidance on paano ang decision. They will just say we'll be governed by these rules, general principles. But, alam mo, marami naman tayong rules dito sa Pilipinas pero nangyari ang formally, hindi pwedeng may lack of accountability and transparency yung batas. At itong pag-fast track nila ng batas itself only shows that the leadership of the House is not really on transparency and accountability here, as if they didn't want the public to study the bill and for the opposition to pose questions. Bakit mo i-fast tracks? I mean, yung SSS, dagdag na pension sa SSS at may bill kami dyan, 1,000 pesos sa lahat ng senior citizens sa buong Pilipinas. Ang tagal-tagal pumasa, tapos ito ang bilis-bilis. So we think accountability and transparency is lost in the bill and even in the procedure towards the passage of the bill.
Ito ho ba because if we look at the initial funds that will be pooled, kumbaga pagsasama-samang pera, yung bulk ho kasi is galing sa GSIS. That's about 125. Yeah. Tapos meron po, 50 billion Social Security. Land Bank, Development Bank at 50B each. And then I think there's also 25 billion that's coming from the national government. I guess my question, Kong Neri, is bakit ho ba yung bulk ay manggagaling sa GSIS? At bakit ho yung contribution ng national government, because meron ho ako nabasa may contribution din ng national government initially na 25 billion. So again, I go back to my previous question. Why is the bulk coming from the GSIS? Would you know?
Well, actually, the first funding, 25 billion, will come from the national government. But yes, you're right. Kasi ang kukunan nila ng pera ay itong maraming assets, sabi nila. At the one with one of the largest assets, of course, other than Land Bank, is the GSIS. The problem with with taking it out from GSIS, a lot of government employees will be affected. They're not even consulted. Wala talaga silang dito eh. These are being held in trust, Pinky. The Supreme Court has decided this in many cases. These SSS funds, for example, held in trust. Therefore, if it's held in trust, may accountability ka sa kung sino man ang lagat ng trust sa'yo. But this is not happening here. And I do not understand, Pinky, why they are fast-tracking such an important bill. Pagdagdag pension, taon-taon bago ipasa. Ito, ang pension, ang pera dadalhin sa Maharlika Fund, ang bilis. Pag pensionado, mahirap. Pag Maharlika, mabilis. So, really
pag-usapan po natin yan because what happened in the committee level, I think that's what you're discussing, and then they want to be able to pass this on second and third reading. I just want to go back to something you said earlier when I was asking you why the GSIS, sabi mo, it's got the most or the biggest asset. When you talk about that, are you talking about what? Funds or people? Ganun ho ba yan? Yung dahil nga, it's the pension fund of government workers. What do you mean when you said ito yung pinakamalaking asset kasi?
Malaki ang asset ng SSS, GSIS, Land Bank. So, yeah, technically they're sources of funds. The initial funding from GSIS is bigger, probably because they thought these are government employees. I don't know the motivation behind the ranking of the funding.
I see. Okay.
But but the fact that they got it from the pension of government employees, and then of course later the private employees too, shows na bakit doon yung kukunin. Pinky, I'd like to raise a prejudicial question. The prejudicial question is this: President Duterte borrowed 7 trillion pesos. Ang utang ng 8 presidente before him only amounted to about 6 to 6.5 trillion pesos. So siya, dinoble niya ang utang ng 7 presidente or 6 na presidente before him. Now, dapat itanong mag-demand si President Marcos, where did you spend this? Ostensibly, it was for COVID response and for the build. COVID response did not even reach 1 trillion pesos. The build, only 12 out of 119 projects were made. So, President Duterte is about 5 trillion pesos to account for. Where is this? Before you go to the public, the pensioners, the taxpayers, go first to the loans because that's the problem in this case. They say they need funds, but there are funds from the trillions of borrowings that must be accounted for before they go to the public and the pensioners and the
also,
members.
Kong Neri, do the pensioners actually have a right to participate? Number one, question and give their sentiments or their position on this, considering that this is the money of those government workers and private workers who every month naguhulog po dyan sa GSIS at SSS. But we need to take a very short break. The source will be right back. The source on CNN Philippines, our source today, former Congressman and Bayan Muna Chairman Neri Colmenares. Congressman, do we have a say or do we have a right to actually support or oppose this?
Yes, we have a right. In fact, if you're asking for legal standing, any member, I believe, could question this before the Supreme Court if they really pass this law. So yeah, in fact, just the concept of trust, trust account. These are not government funds technically. I mean, these are the the premiums and the contribution and the pension of members of SSS and GSIS. So you have all the right to question it, not only to ask government to account for it, and you don't have access to the records. In fact, Pinky, the law says they cannot even withdraw it until 2028. I mean, pera mo yon tapos hindi pala ma-withdraw. For example,
6
GSIS
years.
needs funds or SSS for some emergency reason needs funds. Hindi lang ma-withdraw yung pera na nilagak nila doon. So that makes it more questionable.
Okay, so if this will be passed into law, is this something you plan to question before the Supreme Court?
Yes, well, of course, we will see the final law itself. No? Ano ba yung tinanggal nila? Did they listen to the people? But we'll question this law. Kasi these are not only issues of violation of the charters of the GSIS, SSS, and GFIs, for example. But it's also possible na unconstitutionality ito. Because they opened under section, I think, 29, they opened it to investments with foreign corporations.
Right. Domestic
even
and foreign.
If foreign corporations are majority of the are majority doon sa korporasyon in violation of the Constitution of 60-40 requirement. So yeah, there are many questionable aspects dito sa bill na to.
When you were saying earlier that minamadali po ito dahil nga I think pumunta sa committee muna, small committee, and then there were I think 2 TWGs and then it was passed on the committee level a couple of days later. Siguro yung tanong na lang, Kong Neri, is there anything that could possibly be good or positive about this? Kasi, in many of the conversations that have happened or that will happen, inihahalin tulad po ito sa ilang bansa na meron naman talagang wealth fund na tinatawag. But then again, there are success stories and there are failures, hindi ho ba? Is there anything here that you see could be good for the country?
Under the current context where corruption is rampant and checks and balance mechanism are almost non-existent or compromised at the very least, any such kind of funding will not be a good solution. Point lang, I mean, this is supposed to be taken from members of the SSS, GSIS, and not just them. Lahat tayo kasi taxpayers tayo. They're guaranteeing the funds ang gobyerno. So Ibig sabihin lahat tayo involved dito. Even ordinary taxpayers na magbabayad ng VAT o income tax are also, of course, burdened by this. So, no, for me, under the current context, they first have to stem corruption in government. Despite all these quote-unquote safeguards we had before, marami pa rin corruption. How much more when you have this untransparent fund na hindi natin alam kung saan gagastusin at saan gagamitin. This makes it more questionable and unacceptable to the Filipino people, especially at this time of difficulties and hardships.
Former Congressman and Bayan Muna Party List Chairman Neri Colmenares. Sir, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We will be taking a very short break. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned.